My sister and I were playing outside, and for some reason she got angry and ended up pushing me from a bridge. Then we both got rushed to the hospital and my parents got called. As they rushed in, they asked my sister, "Are you okay? What happened? Who did this to you? Stop crying, please, honey." While I was next to her on oxygen, and my father looked at me disgusted and said, "Stop your drama, you're not dying." While my mother tried to snatch my oxygen mask away because she thought I was faking for attention. That's when the doctor saw what happened and he kicked all of them out. That's when I called 911 and left all of them pale. I've been debating whether to share this story for months, but after everything that's happened, I think it's time. This happened when I was 15, and it completely changed my relationship with my family forever. Some people might think what I did was too extreme, but honestly, after what they put me through, I have zero regrets. My name is Vera Blake, and I have a younger sister named Patsy who was 13 at the time. Growing up, Patsy was always the golden child. She could do no wrong in my parents' eyes, while I was constantly criticized for everything from my grades to the way I folded laundry. My mom, Winifred, and my dad, Robert, made it crystal clear that Patsy was their favorite. They never bothered hiding it. The day everything went to hell started out normal enough. It was a Saturday in late spring, and Patsy and I were hanging out near the old stone bridge that crossed the creek behind our neighborhood. We'd been there countless times before, just talking and throwing rocks into the water below. The bridge wasn't particularly high, maybe 12 feet above the creek, but the water was shallow and there were plenty of rocks jutting out. We'd been having what I thought was a normal conversation about some drama at school when Patsy suddenly got this weird look in her eyes. I was telling her about how my friend Jessica had been spreading rumors about me when she just exploded. "God, Vera, you're so pathetic," she screamed at me. "No wonder nobody likes you. All you do is complain about everything." I was completely taken aback. This came out of nowhere, and the venom in her voice shocked me. "Patsy, what the hell? I was just telling you what happened at school." "You're always the victim, aren't you?" Poor Vera, everyone's so mean to her, she mocked, her face twisted with genuine hatred. "Maybe if you weren't such a loser, people would actually want to be around you." I stared at her, feeling hurt and confused. "Why are you being like this? What did I do?" That's when she shoved me hard. I felt my feet leave the ground, felt that moment of weightlessness before gravity took over. The fall seemed to last forever, but it couldn't have been more than a few seconds before I hit the rocks below. The impact was brutal. I landed on my back, my head slamming against a large boulder with a sickening crack that I actually heard. Pain exploded through my skull, and I could taste blood in my mouth. My vision went dark around the edges, and I could barely breathe. I tried to move, but my body wouldn't respond properly. Somewhere above me, I could hear Patsy screaming, but it sounded distant and muffled. The next thing I remember clearly was waking up in the hospital. There were bright lights above me, and I could hear the steady beeping of machines. My head felt like it was splitting open, and there was this crushing weight on my chest. When I tried to speak, I realized there was a tube down my throat connected to a ventilator. A nurse noticed I was awake and quickly called for the doctor. Dr. Sharp, a middle-aged man with kind eyes, came over and explained my situation. I had suffered a severe traumatic brain injury, 3 broken ribs, a punctured lung, and internal bleeding. The ventilator was keeping me alive while my lung healed, and I'd been unconscious for 2 days. "You're very lucky to be alive," he told me gently. "A few more minutes without medical attention, and we might have lost you." That's when I heard familiar voices in the hallway, and my heart sank. My parents had arrived, along with Patsy. Through the glass window of my room, I could see them clustered around Patsy, who was sitting in a wheelchair with a bandaged wrist. Apparently, she'd hurt her wrist when she tried to climb down to help me after pushing me off the bridge. The irony wasn't lost on me. When they walked into my room, the first words out of my mother's mouth weren't directed at me. "Oh, honey, are you okay?" she said to Patsy, completely ignoring the fact that I was hooked up to life support machines. "What happened? Who did this to you? Stop crying, please, honey." My father was equally focused on Patsy, adjusting the bandage on her wrist and asking if she needed anything. She had apparently injured her wrist when she tried to climb down to help me after pushing me off the bridge. The irony wasn't lost on me. Finally, my father glanced over at me with this look of pure disgust. "Stop your drama, Vera. You're not dying," he said dismissively. "We know you're just trying to get attention like you always do." I couldn't speak because of the ventilator, but my eyes must have shown my shock and hurt. That only seemed to irritate my mother more. "Oh, please," she said, rolling her eyes. You're probably faking half of this. Before I could react, she actually reached over and tried to disconnect one of my 4 lines. Let's see how sick you really are. The moment she touched my 4, alarms started going off on my monitors. My heart rate spiked as I started panicking, which made my breathing even more difficult through the oxygen tubes in my nose. I was genuinely struggling, my vision going dark again, when Dr. Sharp burst into the room. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" he shouted at my mother, immediately checking my 4 lines and monitors. The fury in his voice was unmistakable. "Get away from my patient right now." "She's our daughter," my father said indignantly. "She's just being dramatic." Dr. Sharp looked at him like he'd grown a second head. "Your daughter has a severe brain injury and a punctured lung. She's on life support. If you interfere with her medical equipment again, I'll have security remove you from the hospital permanently." "But Patsy needs us," my mother protested. "She's traumatized." "Then take Patsy to the family waiting area," Dr. Sharp said firmly. "All of you. Get out of this room now, and don't come back until you can behave like actual parents." After they left, Dr. Sharp stayed with me for a while, checking my vitals and making sure I was stable. "I'm so sorry that happened," he said quietly. "No patient should have to deal with that, especially not from their own family." Over the next few days, the pattern continued. My parents would visit Patsy constantly, bringing her flowers, her favorite snacks, and new books to read. They'd spend hours in her room, laughing and talking, while I lay alone in my room with just the nurses for company. The few times they bothered to check on me, it was only to criticize me for milking the situation or to ask when I'd be ready to go home so they wouldn't have to keep driving to the hospital. The worst part was listening to them talk to other people. I overheard my mother on the phone with my aunt, spinning this sob story about how poor Patsy had been so traumatized by seeing me fall, and how hard this was on their sensitive daughter. She made it sound like I'd fallen on my own, just clumsy Vera being clumsy again, but the final straw came on my 4th day in the hospital. I was finally off the ventilator and could speak, though my voice was still weak and raspy. Patsy was discharged the day before with nothing more than a sprained wrist, but my parents were still treating her like she was the victim. They were in my room, ostensibly visiting me, but really just complaining about how inconvenient my hospitalization was for them. "The gas money we're spending driving here every day is ridiculous," my father was saying. "And your mother had to miss her book club meeting because of this nonsense. When exactly are you planning to stop this act?" My mother added. "The doctors say you could probably go home tomorrow if you wanted to. You're just choosing to stay here for attention." That's when I realized that nothing had changed. Even after seeing me on life support, even after a doctor had to physically throw them out of my room for endangering my life, they still saw me as the problem. They still believed that Patsy was the victim and I was just being dramatic. I was done. Completely and utterly done. "You know what?" I said, my voice stronger than it had been all week. "You're right. I'm going to stop this act. All of it." They looked pleased, thinking they'd finally gotten through to me. "Good," my father said. "It's about time you grew up and stopped being so selfish." "Oh, I'm going to stop being selfish," I agreed. "In fact, I'm going to stop being your daughter altogether." Before they could ask what I meant, I reached for the phone by my bed and dialed 911. "911, what's your emergency?" the dispatcher asked. "Hi, I need to report a case of child abuse and attempted murder," I said clearly, making sure my parents could hear every word. The color drained from both their faces instantly. My mother grabbed for the phone, but I pulled it away. "My name is Vera Blake, and I'm 15 years old. I'm currently in room 314 at St. Mary's Hospital after my 13-year-old sister Patsy Blake pushed me off a bridge 4 days ago. When my parents Robert and Winifred Blake arrived at the hospital, they ignored my life-threatening injuries and focused entirely on my sister's minor sprained wrist. My mother Winifred Blake physically attempted to remove my oxygen mask while I was on life support, nearly killing me. I have witnesses to this, including Dr. Sharp and several nurses. "Vera, hang up that phone right now," my father hissed, but I continued talking to the dispatcher. "I also need to report that this is part of a long pattern of emotional abuse and neglect. I have documentation going back years, including report cards where they wrote nasty comments about me, text messages, and a detailed journal I've been keeping." This was partially true. I'd been keeping a detailed journal for years about the way they treated me compared to Patsy, and I did have some text messages from particularly bad arguments. I'd started documenting things after a guidance counselor at school had suggested it during a conversation about my home life, though I'd never planned to use it like this. The dispatcher assured me that officers would be sent to the hospital immediately, along with someone from Child Protective Services. I hung up the phone and looked at my parents, who were both standing there in complete shock. "You can't be serious," my mother whispered. "Dead serious," I replied. "I'm done pretending that the way you treat me is normal or acceptable. I'm done being your scapegoat while Patsy gets away with literally trying to kill me." "She didn't try to kill you," my father protested. "It was an accident." "Really?" "Because she looked me in the eye and told me I was pathetic and that nobody liked me before she shoved me off that bridge. And you know what? Even if it was an accident, your reaction to seeing your child on life support was to accuse her of faking it and physically assault her. What kind of parents do that?" They didn't have an answer for that. Within an hour, 2 police officers arrived, followed shortly by a CPS worker named Mrs. Bell. My parents tried to charm them at first, playing the role of concerned parents dealing with a troubled teenager. But their story started falling apart quickly when Dr. Sharp was interviewed. "I've been practicing medicine for 20 years, he told the officers, and I have never seen parents react to their child's critical injuries the way these 2 did. The mother actually tried to tamper with the patient's 4 lines and medical equipment. If I hadn't intervened, she could have seriously harmed her own daughter." The nurses backed up his story, and hospital records showed the stark difference in how my parents had treated Patsy versus me. The contrast was undeniable. But the real nail in the coffin was when they interviewed Patsy. My little sister, who had always been protected and coddled, completely cracked under gentle questioning from a child psychologist. She admitted to pushing me on purpose because she was mad that Vera always got attention for being dramatic. She even admitted that our parents had always told her she was the special one and that I was just difficult. When pressed about why she thought pushing me off a bridge was an appropriate response to being annoyed, she couldn't give a coherent answer. It became clear that she'd been so spoiled and protected from consequences her entire life that she genuinely didn't understand that actions have serious repercussions. The police began building a case over the following weeks for child endangerment and assault. The assault charge came from my mother interfering with my medical equipment, which could have seriously harmed me. They were also being investigated for the long-term emotional abuse and neglect that I'd documented. Patsy was placed in temporary custody with my Aunt Carol, my father's sister, who had always been kind to me but lived several states away. Carol was horrified when she learned what had happened and immediately started asking why no one had told her how bad things were at home. As for me, I was placed in foster care once I was discharged from the hospital. It wasn't ideal, but it was infinitely better than going home to people who had proven they cared more about appearances than my actual life. The legal proceedings took months. My parents hired an expensive lawyer and tried to paint me as a troubled teenager who was making up stories for attention. They claimed that Patsy's push had been accidental and that they'd been emotionally overwhelmed at the hospital, not thinking clearly. But the evidence was overwhelming. The security footage, the medical staff's testimony, Dr. Sharp's detailed account of my mother's assault on me, and my years of documentation all painted a clear picture of a family where one child was systematically abused while the other was enabled and protected. The breaking point in their defense came when their lawyer tried to argue that I was exaggerating my injuries for sympathy. Dr. Sharp was called as an expert witness, and he brought medical scans showing the extent of my brain injury. The patient had bleeding in her brain that required immediate surgical intervention, he testified. Her lung was punctured and collapsed. She was minutes away from death when the paramedics found her. These are not the kind of injuries someone can fake or exaggerate. The idea that a 15-year-old girl would somehow orchestrate this level of trauma for attention is frankly insulting to everyone's intelligence. In the end, my parents were convicted. My father got 6 months in jail and 2 years probation for child endangerment. My mother got 8 months and 3 years probation for the additional assault charge. They also had to complete parenting classes and anger management, though by that point, it was too late to matter. Patsy was required to attend therapy and community service for her role in my injuries. The judge made it clear that her age was the only thing saving her from more serious consequences, and that pushing someone off a bridge, regardless of the reason, was assault. But the real consequences went far beyond the legal ones. Word spread quickly through our small town about what had happened. My parents had always been very concerned with their reputation, and now everyone knew they were under investigation for child abuse. My father started losing clients from his accounting business, and my mother was quietly asked to step down from her position on the school board. Their friends started avoiding them, not wanting to be associated with people who were being investigated for child abuse. The story even made the local newspaper, with a headline "Local Parents Under Investigation for Child Endangerment." Patsy struggled badly with the fallout. She'd gone from being the protected golden child to being known as the girl who pushed her sister off a bridge. Kids at school started avoiding her, and she had trouble making friends. The therapy helped her understand the severity of what she'd done, but she also had to live with the consequences of being spoiled and enabled for so long. My Aunt Carol tried to help, but Patsy was angry and resentful about losing her privileged position. She blamed me for ruining the family and couldn't seem to understand that actions have consequences. The last I heard, she was still struggling with taking responsibility for her choices. As for me, I ended up thriving in foster care. My foster parents, David and Marie Thompson, were amazing people who treated me like their own daughter. They supported my education, encouraged my interests, and most importantly, they believed me when I told them about my experiences. I graduated high school with honors and got a full scholarship to college, something my birth parents had always told me I wasn't smart enough to achieve. I'm currently studying social work, inspired partly by Mrs. Bell and the other CPS workers who helped me. The best part of my new life was learning what a normal family actually looked like. David and Marie never played favorites with their biological children. They celebrated everyone's achievements equally and dealt with problems through communication, not by making one child the scapegoat. I did eventually have contact with my birth family again, but not in the way they'd hoped. About 2 years after the trial, my parents reached out through a lawyer, wanting to reconcile. They'd apparently expected that once their legal troubles were over, I'd come running back home like nothing had happened. The lawyer explained that they'd completed their court-ordered programs and wanted to move forward as a family. I agreed to one supervised meeting, mostly out of curiosity to see if they'd actually changed. They hadn't. The meeting took place at the CPS office with Mrs. Bell present. Within 10 minutes, it was clear that my parents still saw themselves as the victims. They spent most of the time complaining about how my false accusations had ruined their lives and demanding that I recant my statements. "We've lost friends, your father's business is struggling, and Patsy is having problems at school," my mother said accusingly. "Are you happy now? You've destroyed this family." "I didn't destroy anything," I replied calmly. "I reported child abuse and attempted murder. The consequences you're facing are the natural result of your own actions." "It wasn't attempted murder," my father insisted. "Patsy is just a child. Children make mistakes." "And what about your mistake?" I asked. "What do you call trying to remove my oxygen mask while I was on life support?" He didn't have an answer for that. The meeting ended with them demanding I come home and fix the damage I'd caused to their reputation. When I refused, they accused me of being vindictive and ungrateful. "After everything we've done for you," my mother said bitterly. "Yeah," I replied. "After everything you've done for me, I think I'll stay right where I am." Mrs. Bell had been taking notes throughout the meeting, and she looked up with obvious disgust. "Mr. and Mrs. Blake, I've been doing this job for 15 years, and I have never seen parents so completely lacking in self-awareness. Your daughter nearly died because of your family's dysfunction, and you're sitting here demanding that she fix your reputation? That's not how this works." My father started to argue, but Mrs. Bell cut him off. "The meeting is over. Vera, you're under no obligation to have further contact with these people. Your safety and well-being are what matter here." As we were leaving, my mother grabbed my arm. "Vera, please. You don't understand what you've put us through. The neighbors won't talk to us, your father's lost half his clients, and Patsy cries herself to sleep every night. Don't you feel any guilt about what you've done to this family?" I looked at her hand on my arm, then back at her face. "The only thing I feel guilty about is not reporting you sooner. Maybe if I had, Patsy would have learned that actions have consequences before she tried to kill me." "She didn't try to kill you," my father shouted, loud enough that other people in the CPS office turned to stare. "She pushed me off a 12-foot bridge onto rocks," I said calmly. "What did she think was going to happen? That I'd bounce?" They didn't have an answer for that, and that really was the last time I spoke to them directly. But the aftermath of my 911 call continued to ripple through their lives in ways I only learned about later. My Aunt Carol, who had taken in Patsy, kept me updated on the family drama whether I wanted to hear it or not. She felt guilty for not knowing how bad things were and seemed to think keeping me informed was somehow making amends. According to Carol, the criminal charges were just the beginning of my parents' problems. The story had made the rounds locally, with several of my former classmates sharing articles about the case. The details of what happened at the hospital were shocking enough that the story spread widely in our community. My father's accounting business completely collapsed within 6 months. It wasn't just that he lost clients, though he did lose most of them. The real problem was that his reputation in the business community was destroyed. Nobody wanted to trust their finances to someone who had been convicted of child endangerment. He tried to get a job with other accounting firms, but his criminal record and the notoriety of the case made him unemployable in his field. He eventually ended up working at a big box store, making barely above minimum wage. The man who had always prided himself on being successful and respected was suddenly struggling to pay his bills. My mother fared even worse in some ways. She had always been very involved in community organizations, serving on the school board, organizing charity events, and basically being one of those women whose identity was tied up in being seen as a pillar of the community. All of that evaporated overnight. She was quietly asked to resign from the school board, kicked out of her book club, and dropped from the organizing committee for the annual charity gala. The women she had considered her closest friends suddenly wouldn't return her calls. The isolation hit her particularly hard because she had no idea how to function without social status. She started drinking heavily and gained a significant amount of weight. According to Carol, she barely left the house except for work and court-ordered counseling sessions. Their marriage also started falling apart under the strain. They had always presented this image of being the perfect family, but when that facade crumbled, there wasn't much left underneath. They blamed each other for the legal troubles, fought constantly about money, and couldn't agree on how to handle Patsy's behavioral problems. Speaking of Patsy, her adjustment was probably the most complex part of this whole situation. She had gone from being the golden child who could do no wrong to being known as the girl who pushed her sister off a bridge. The cognitive dissonance was apparently massive. In her old life, whenever Patsy had problems, my parents would either fix them for her or blame someone else. Now she was facing real consequences for the first time in her life, and she had no idea how to cope. She struggled academically because she'd never had to work hard before. My parents had always made excuses for her or blamed her teachers when she didn't do well. Living with Carol, who had reasonable expectations and didn't treat her like a precious princess, was a huge adjustment. Socially, things were even worse. Kids at school knew what had happened, and many of them avoided her. She tried to play the victim, claiming that I had made her push me by being annoying, but that excuse didn't fly with teenagers who could see right through her manipulation. She also struggled with the fact that Carol actually held her accountable for her actions. When Patsy would throw tantrums or try to manipulate situations, Carol would calmly explain that those behaviors wouldn't work in her house. Patsy was expected to do chores, maintain decent grades, and treat others with respect, radical concepts in her world. The court-ordered therapy was apparently a nightmare at first. Patsy spent the first several months insisting that everything was my fault and that she was the real victim. The therapist, Dr. Stone, had to work extensively on helping her understand that her actions had consequences and that she couldn't blame others for her choices. According to Carol, there were multiple sessions where Patsy would storm out, screaming that everyone was against her and that she wanted to go home to our parents. But our parents couldn't take her back even if they wanted to. Their custody had been terminated, and they were still on probation. The reality of her situation slowly started to sink in. She wasn't going back to her old life where she was treated like a princess. She wasn't going to magically become popular at school by playing the victim. And she couldn't manipulate Carol the way she had manipulated our parents. It took almost a year of therapy before Patsy started to show any real progress. Dr. Stone later told Carol that it was one of the most challenging cases she'd worked with because Patsy had been so thoroughly enabled and protected from consequences that she genuinely didn't understand cause and effect. The breakthrough came when Dr. Stone showed Patsy medical scans of my brain injury. Up until that point, Patsy had been minimizing what happened, claiming she'd just given me a little push and that I was being dramatic about getting hurt. But seeing the actual damage to my brain, the bleeding, the swelling, the areas where tissue had been destroyed, finally made it real for her. Dr. Stone explained that brain injuries like mine often resulted in death, and that I'd been incredibly lucky to survive with my cognitive abilities intact. That session was apparently when Patsy finally broke down and admitted that she could have killed me. She spent weeks after that dealing with the guilt and horror of realizing how close she'd come to being a murderer at 13 years old. But even then, her progress was slow and uneven. She'd have good days where she seemed to genuinely understand the gravity of what she'd done, followed by bad days where she'd revert to blaming me or claiming that everyone was being too hard on her. The trauma wasn't limited to our immediate family either. Carol told me that the whole extended family had been affected by the scandal. My paternal grandparents, who had always doted on Patsy, were horrified by what she'd done and struggled with how to maintain a relationship with her. My maternal grandmother actually cut off contact with my parents entirely, telling anyone who would listen that she was ashamed to be related to people who would treat their own child that way. She tried to reach out to me through Carol, wanting to apologize for not knowing what was happening and to offer support. I appreciated the gesture, but I wasn't ready for contact with anyone from that side of the family. Too many people had witnessed my parents' treatment of me over the years without speaking up. The fact that they suddenly cared after it made the news felt too little, too late. The financial consequences for my parents were also more severe than I'd initially realized. Legal fees for their criminal defense had been astronomical, especially since they'd hired a high-profile lawyer who promised to get the charges dropped. That obviously didn't work out, but they'd still paid him tens of thousands of dollars. They also faced a civil lawsuit from the hospital. Apparently, when my mother tried to tamper with my 4 lines, she damaged some expensive monitoring equipment in addition to potentially harming me. The hospital wanted compensation for the equipment and for the additional medical staff time required to stabilize me after her interference. On top of that, they were being sued by Patsy's temporary guardian appointed by the court before Carol took over. The guardian was seeking reimbursement for Patsy's therapy costs and other expenses, arguing that they shouldn't have to absorb the financial burden of fixing the damage my parents had caused. My foster parents, David and Marie, kept me shielded from most of this drama, but they did make sure I understood that none of it was my fault. They were incredible advocates for me throughout the legal process, attending every hearing and making sure my voice was heard. One of the most validating moments came during the sentencing hearing, when the judge addressed my parents directly. "I've been on this bench for 22 years, Judge Williams said, and I have rarely seen such a clear case of parental failure. Mrs. Blake, when you attempted to remove your daughter's oxygen mask, you weren't just endangering her life, you were sending a message that her well-being meant nothing to you compared to maintaining your preferred narrative." He turned to my father. "Mr. Blake, your complete dismissal of your daughter's life-threatening injuries while coddling her sister shows a level of emotional abuse that frankly disgusts me. The fact that you still don't seem to understand the severity of your actions makes me question whether you should ever be allowed around children again." The judge also had words for the enabling behavior that had led to Patsy's actions. This girl pushed her sister off a bridge because she'd been raised to believe she could do no wrong and that Vera existed to absorb blame for family problems. That's not normal sibling rivalry, that's a family dynamic so toxic it nearly resulted in murder. Hearing a judge validate everything I'd experienced was incredibly powerful. For years, I'd been told I was overreacting, being too sensitive, or making things up for attention. Having an objective authority figure look at the evidence and conclude that my parents were abusive felt like finally being believed. The impact on my mental health was significant too, though not in the way people might expect. Many people assumed I'd be traumatized and struggling, but the opposite was true. Finally being free from that toxic environment was like being able to breathe properly for the first time in my life. David and Marie made sure I got counseling to process everything that had happened, but my therapist, Dr. Kim, was amazed by how well I was adjusting. Most kids who've experienced this level of family dysfunction struggle with trust issues, depression, and behavioral problems, she told my foster parents. Vera is remarkably resilient. I think having her experiences validated and seeing consequences for the people who hurt her has actually been healing for her. The contrast between my old life and my new life was stark. In my birth family, I'd walked on eggshells constantly, never knowing when I'd be blamed for something or when Patsy would have one of her explosive outbursts. With David and Marie, I could just be a normal teenager. They celebrated my achievements without comparing me to anyone else. When I made honor roll, they put my report card on the refrigerator and took me out to dinner. When I joined the debate team and won my first tournament, they came to watch and cheered for me just as loudly as they did for their biological kids. It was the first time in my life that I felt like I mattered to the adults who were supposed to care for me. Patsy did reach out to me once when she turned 18. She was living with my Aunt Carol but struggling with depression and anger issues. She wanted to apologize for what happened and asked if we could have a relationship. I agreed to talk to her, and we had several long conversations over video chat. She seemed genuinely remorseful about pushing me off the bridge and acknowledged that she could have killed me. She'd also admitted that she'd been spoiled and entitled growing up, and that she was working hard to change those patterns in therapy. However, she still struggled with taking full responsibility. She kept making excuses about being young and not understanding consequences, and she seemed to expect me to just forgive and forget because we're family. When I explained that forgiveness doesn't mean pretending nothing happened, and that rebuilding trust would take time and consistent effort, she got frustrated. She accused me of holding grudges and said I was being too harsh about something that happened when she was just a kid. "It's been years, Vera," she said during our last conversation. When are you going to get over this and move on? I have moved on, I told her. I have a great life with people who actually care about me. But moving on doesn't mean I have to pretend you didn't try to kill me or that our parents didn't abuse me for years. If you can't understand that, then we don't have anything else to talk about. She hung up on me, and I haven't heard from her since. I'm now 27, graduated from college 5 years ago, and have been working as a social worker specializing in child abuse cases for 3 years. I love my job, and I'm good at it because I understand what these kids are going through. I've also been in a relationship with an amazing guy named Michael for 2 years, and we're talking about getting married. My foster parents officially adopted me when I turned 18, and they're walking me down the aisle when Michael and I get married next year. They've given me something my biological family never could: unconditional love and support. Do I regret calling 911 that day in the hospital? Not for a second. Was it dramatic? Maybe. But you know what was really dramatic? Nearly dying because my own sister pushed me off a bridge, then having my parents try to kill me again in my hospital bed because they thought I was faking it. Some people might say I destroyed my family, but I disagree. I exposed a family that was already broken. I just refused to keep pretending everything was fine while I was being systematically abused and neglected. The truth is, my real family is David, Marie, and their kids. They're the ones who showed up for my high school graduation, helped me through college, and celebrated my achievements. They're the ones who'll be at my wedding, and hopefully, they'll be the grandparents to my future children. As for my biological family, they made their choice years ago when they decided Patsy was worth protecting and I was worth sacrificing. I just made sure there were consequences for that choice. People always ask if I miss them or feel guilty about what happened to them. The honest answer is no. You can't miss something you never really had, and I never had parents who truly loved and protected me. What I had was people who kept me around to serve as Patsy's emotional punching bag and their convenient scapegoat. I do sometimes wonder what would have happened if they'd reacted differently at the hospital. If they'd shown even a shred of concern for my injuries, if they treated me like their daughter instead of an inconvenience. Would I have still called 911? Would I have still pursued legal action? I don't know. But I'm glad I'll never have to find out, because the life I have now is better than anything I could have had with them. The scar on the back of my head from hitting that rock serves as a daily reminder of how close I came to dying, both from the fall and from my mother's attempt to remove my oxygen mask. But instead of making me bitter, it reminds me how strong I am and how far I've come. I survived a family that didn't want me, nearly died from injuries they caused, and still managed to build a life worth living. If that's not the ultimate revenge, I don't know what is. To anyone reading this who's in a similar situation, document everything, trust your instincts, and don't be afraid to ask for help. You deserve better than people who treat you like you're disposable, even if those people share your DNA. And to my biological family, if you're reading this, you reap what you sow. I hope it was worth it.